Hello once again, everyone. So I have not been able to put out a ton of footage recently because we've been very busy preparing for not only our own event, but also the Florence Ren Fair, which is happening this weekend. I might get some footage of that maybe for the channel. But either way, I wanted to take the time to go over some ideas that I've had kicking around, and since Jake, my resident Italian, is just here and has nothing better to do, I'm going to bully him about it. So, what is this video focused on? This video is focused on the idea of how to avoid hard hits. Now, what I'm meaning here is that, especially from an outside perspective, it looks like, oh, how are you not braining each other? You're hitting each other with, 3 to 4 pound weights of steel. Now, in particular, I made sure that I grabbed my, albeit Lichtenauer for this, as this sword is often considered quite dense compared to a lot of others. In fact, Jake, actually, is that the Effect Book or Fechterspiel? Fechterspiel. Okay, there you go. So that's also a relatively dense sword comparatively to things like Siggy's or an Albion Meyer, etc. So a lot of people from the outside, they pick these up and they're like, oh my god, how do you get hit with these? And then from the other perspective is also, most times when you're training, or at least the way it should be, you don't receive very many hard hits, but when the blood gets up, even if you've trained well, there are certain things that can still occur that can lead to a hit landing harder. So first off, let's talk about basic philosophy. And that is the idea of where I'm targeting. So Jake right now is in a relatively light longsword setup. For general fencing, this is still fine, of course. He's in the Spez Kaftan, which is relatively new. He's got the Spez forearms, Spez elbows, right? He's got no actual hard place. There's a padding in there, though. Spez heavies, mass courgette. We don't have the legs on, so we're not worrying about that right now. Now, the biggest thing that people get injured with, the main places you receive hard hits, are going to be on the upper portion of the arm. Generally, they're going to be kind of into this, a good solid hit higher up on the wrist, sometimes slightly going over the wrist, and then of course, the smashing of the thumbs and the cracking of the head. Now, shins are also another thing, but we'll talk about that later. For now, at least, let's go over just how do I strike to not cause an injury. The first thing that you can think about is kind of treating this a bit like kendo. So in case you didn't know, kendo, they don't wear a ton of protective gear, right? In fact, I have a whole video going over it. They only count hits to target, which is something that you can add into your personal philosophy to add a little bit of extra protection, because the places that we guard are generally also the places that you're aiming anyway. So could you assume any guard you want to make? Perfect, okay? So yes, I can absolutely blast his forearm right now if I want to, but that's not exactly very advantageous. Or I could crack his hands or things along those lines. What I'm more focused on is if I'm gonna hit Jake, I'm not interested in just, I want to hit, right? Because that doesn't really necessarily do me a lot of good. That's why I refer to as silhouette cutting, where you're only really focused on hitting the outside shape of the person. Now, there are times that I will intentionally cut there to drive into places, but that's fencing. We're just talking about hitting right now. What I want to focus on when I'm striking Jake is not just I'm going to hit shape like a hitbox, and that's great. What I'm more focused on is what of Jake do I want to strike? Am I trying to strike him in the face, okay? In which case, if I'm trying to hit him in the face, you notice that my arms get a lot more extended, as opposed to dense chop. It's much more along the lines of extension, which sure, that has velocity, and Jake is not necessarily enjoying himself right now, but it's not at all the same compared to getting densely hit. Same thing when I'm going into his chest or things along those lines. It's that idea of extension. Sure, I stuck him good, but there was no actual blunt force as part of that. It just terminates. When I apply that to striking something like an arm, etc., it's the same idea. I'm going out onto target, not onto silhouette. And this gets into regards of not only an important cutting mechanic, but also an important mechanic for making your hits extend more. I refer to this as Lego man arms. So, in case you've never played Legos, one, your life is very sad, but Legos cannot flex like this. They can only keep their hands straight up because their wrists don't flex forward. When you cut like that, everything is very dense, because what essentially happens is this gets all of that concentrated momentum straight onto target. So this, even with one hand, hits about the same as two hands on a nicer hit, right? What can alleviate that is if I let my arm extend, sure, that's still a percussive hit, absolutely, but it's going forward and over him, not everything landing directly on him. So when I apply that to all of my hits, the idea of extension, that's not bad. Still a good hit, but it's not hurting him. I apply that again. I can apply that to his head. Okay. Now you'll notice I am not relaxing my hit, which is something that people do try to do to make this a little bit worse. But the problem is, if your only solution for alleviating force is relaxing at the end, two things are going to occur. Number one is that you'll assume you can hit quite hard as long as I relax at the end, right? So that leads to you having this big wind up and then a little bit of relaxation. Right now I just did and Jake is fine. Can you do that consistently when the blood is up? And should you? Could you not just spend time doing something else? Second thing that can happen is when you relax, especially if you relax early, that hit did not land where I wanted it to, right? Because my structure went away. By keeping structure, sure, I'm hitting Jake, but that's exactly where I want it to be. I'm hitting him right in the protective gear, specifically on the edge of his fencing mask, so it's defaulting to a place that is very structurally strong. Same thing with his forearms, etc. Now, that's great, grand, and wonderful, but what about places that aren't as heavily protected? For example, the outside of the arm. This is a place where, when I was younger, I would actually intentionally hit people here. In case you didn't know, there's actually a nerve that runs right there, and if you can hit it hard enough, it can shut an arm down. Don't do that, right? But point is, people get hit here a lot, and it causes their arms to have a significant amount of pain, very serious bruising. Same thing also with the curve of this shoulder. I've seen some pretty horrendous hits. Why is this happening? Part of this is what we'll lead into again in a moment, but the main reason is that people are targeting the head and then they're not actually continuing their stroke. So, what this means, and this note that these targets are on the right side of his body, meaning more often, unless I'm left-handed, I am throwing a strike from my left side. What you want to consider when you do this is if I'm just chopping, yeah, that's going to hit hard, right? Even if I don't step into it, that's still a lot of torque, because by default, your cuts coming down from your left side, your reversos, etc., those are just stronger. They're backhanded cuts. They're a very tight, very strong mechanical thing to do. So what you need to make sure of is even if I'm not stepping, it's that same idea of extension. One, do I actually want to hit him there? Or was I just swinging at vague opening and I wanted to hit him? It should be, I'm intentionally striking the target, or I'm striking the target, striking to target. Those are all fine. I'll even pass into these ones. Nothing bad, right? Head. Okay. Let's go ahead and give something a little bit more extended, so I'm starting from a tip forward. Okay. That had decent mechanics behind it, but Jake is not the worse for wear. And that's not just because Jake is a badass, it's also because, again, what am I trying to hit? If I always have an idea of what I'm trying to hit, then I can do just enough and no more. But if I'm just, I want to hit that opening, yeah, I don't want to be there for that either, right? So, that's a big part of it. What are you aiming at? Why should you be striking there? And that also nicely brings us to the idea of the hands and the various issues of hitting the hands. So number one, I'm not going to be one of those people that says, don't hit hands. That's stupid. Don't hit hands. No, absolutely hit hands. Like if Jake is holding them out there and he's not doing anything, yeah, that's perfectly fine. I don't care. We all have a good laugh about it. When hands get hurt are usually in two regards. Number one, you're choosing to hit hands instead of arms. So even though, and I will die on this hill, Spez Heavies are the best hand protection that we can currently wear, and I'll put them above everything else, they are not perfect. There is no perfect hand protection because we've got to protect such a dexterous thing, right? Short of just fencing in like balls, right? So, number one is choosing not to strike hands and instead strike the arm, where not only the protection is probably better built, but also in general, there's less that can be immediately damaged. These are all relatively small bones. These are big bones. Yes, you can still damage the forearm, and I'm not giving you a free clear, oh, if I want to hit hard, I'll just hit his arm instead. No. It's that generally, when we're told to strike things, usually is delivered to the arm. So to give a good example of this, for example, we'll go ahead and do Decade and Chingaro, a play we've talked about before that Jake's very familiar with. The idea here is I threaten his face to bring his blade out, and then I choose to strike him onto the arm. Now, could I still achieve the same play striking him in the hands? Absolutely, and I do that all the time, right? The question is, did getting the hands actually get me anything? Not really. I mean, it's the same opening either way, but the biggest thing is when I go for his arms, I can choose to hit him on that guard, and I'm also driving him further. If I choose to hit him on the hands, yeah, especially if he moves, that protected gear is a lot less certain. Arms are relatively stagnant, right? Even when he tanked turrets to try and protect himself, that's a big target that's just leading to more protective gear. Hitting the hands, though, those are things that move, and you can very easily end up falling into these gaps. Now, that's just one example, right? In general, I don't even target the hands unless it's more of a thing of, hey, they're out there, watch it, right? Unless I'm doing things like a slice, right? That's a different scenario entirely, though. If his arms are up, and I see opportunity to slice, again, that's not me hitting him as hard as I can, right? If I were choosing to lead with that, oh look, now I'm targeting the forearms again, rather than targeting the hands anyway. And certainly in regards to where like he is cutting forward and I choose to cut his hands in the same tempo, right? Forearms, once more, not trying to target onto the hands, because there's just no point. If I can get hands, I can get forearms. And if I can get forearms, Jake will probably keep fencing with me. If you can't make that adjustment and you all of a sudden, you're having all these problems, maybe you need to reassess things anyway. But the final portion for this part, at least that I want to talk about, is, okay, but I wasn't trying to hit him on the hands, and I destroyed his hands anyway when I was trying to hit something deeper. This goes back to the Lego man arm thing, and this is a very, very common problem, so let's go into detail about it. The most common place where hands, especially thumbs, get destroyed, but you weren't aiming at them, is when he is also out point forward. Usually someone is standing in a long plank, post along or what have you, and someone else is trying to cut into target. So usually what happens is people are both saying like, we're talking tournament at the moment, people are saying like this, someone tries to cut into the head, going for the body, but they don't extend their tip. So, what am I talking about here? Well, I have your tip slightly up so I can get a little closer. Basically what's happening, let's actually turn this angle a little bit. Let me go over here. There we go. Sorry, trying to get this best line. Perfect. Now we can really see that thumb. So number one, great hand protection. Still love the Spez heavies, but it's inevitable that it will slightly protrude beyond the guard. Just happens, right? So what happens with Lego man arms is, remember I talked about that density of impact. If I am targeting his head and I let my arms extend, yes, my blade can even come onto his thumbs, but all my velocity is in my tip. It's going over his hands. And in fact, I've had this happen multiple times where I've actually hit someone's hands, but his thumb is not the thing that's taking the force. It's still going where I want it to go, into his chest or into his face or what have you. But when I'm looking at his head, but I cut with Lego man arms, everything goes straight down into that valley. And that's when thumbs get destroyed. Because guaranteed, if this door was opened, he's probably rushing to close it as that happens. And when those things come together, everything defaults onto the thumb. Now, part of this, of course, should be, parry better, right? In regards to dealing with this as, you can't control what the other person is doing, you should try and parry a bit more with your tip forward whenever these things happen, because it will widen the wedge. But in regards to, looking at it on yourself, because if we can make this common enough that people stop swinging this way, then we won't have to worry about that as much. You should examine whenever you're cutting for body, that you are actually cutting for body, and that you are not forgetting to extend, thus leading to everything defaulting down the line. Now, that's not to say there aren't times that you will cut with a wedge. In particular, one of the things that I know people like to do is basically the idea of forcing the blade. So what that would look like is and usually do this from a further back position, I push my strong into his guard to then extend either a thrust or a cut through. That is absolutely something you do in a variety of sword systems. The issue with that is that people forget that this is supposed to be at the blade to get my tip through, because again, this is just in the way. I'm focusing on hitting him, and just turn this into down. I made the wedge, but at what cost? Again, I'd really like to be able to fence Jake some more. I don't want to break him. So, most times that you find yourself in a situation where you are hitting someone too hard, you are either not actively targeting anything, you are choosing to hit somewhere where you could go for something better, right? I.e. going for the arms rather than the hands, because it's a choice, right? Same thing in regards to attacking the legs. Actually, let's go to that for a moment. So Jake is not currently wearing his leg guards, but this is fine because his trousers actually show the same thing. We wear shin guards to make it relatively safe to target the legs if need be, especially in something like sword and buckler, side sword, what have you. This is a very, very common target. However, you can still make a choice here, right? Some shin guards are very good. I actually like mine a lot. Jake likes his a lot. Some are not so good, right? Especially as we try to make them slimmer, more targets are exposed. And there's also the choice of, hey, how much juice am I putting in this right now? For example, Let's say that I was doing something relatively extended, right? Jake has completely not paid attention. I am choosing to do something relatively light, like a tap. Or if we're fighting single-hand sword, something I can very much control. I'm giving him a bop, not even a full cut. It's more of an extension than anything else. Cutting 2, not 3. That's just fine for hitting a shin guard, right? He'll be just fine. There's really no danger. Heck, you can even do that to bare leg most times and people are going to be okay. If I make the choice of, hey, this one I'm going to actually cut him, usually I will go ahead and raise that target to more dense padding. Now in Jake's case, he's extra lucky because he's got the caftan and the trousers and he's a big boy. So he's doing just fine. But in regards to striking against people who are in things like, the trousers I'm in right now, again, if I'm going to choose to hit a target, usually if I'm going to do a through cut, I do actually prefer to hit higher up on the thigh as opposed to down into the shin. One is because the more I go for the shin, usually the more I have to extend myself, meaning the more disconnected my cut is becoming, the more force it's gaining on its own. 2 is that generally if I'm going for the thigh, odds are I'm not going to be staying there after I finish my cut because of whatever we're doing. It's going to be through, and then I'm moving to whatever I'm moving to next. Now, there will be times when this rule is of course broken because of what you're doing. And with good training, as long as you know what you're aiming at, hey, I'm trying to achieve this thing, you won't be hitting people too hard. But when you just go again, I'm going to hit leg. What is leg, right? And then bad things happen. So, another thing to consider in that regard. You are, again, actively aiming, not just swinging at blank target, and I'm choosing to take whatever will deal with the force best, preferably. And then the final thing is the idea of, again, not properly extending. If you cut densely, you will hit densely. If you cut with extension, you will hit the way these swords are supposed to hit, and also you'll have better cutting mechanics eventually. And you may even find you start landing some cuts into thrust, which is kind of what a lot of these techniques end up as anyway, so anyway though. Those are generally the main things I want to bring up, but let's now talk about, okay, here are some specific situations that I see again and again and again and again, where we can identify the culprit. Because odds are you've probably fallen into one of these before, and so we can identify what went wrong. So, the first place was I've already talked about. The idea of I was trying to wedge down the middle, I was looking at his head, but I wasn't extending my guard, everything goes down onto his thumb. That can happen on both sides. Again, I was targeting his head, but I never actually extended my point, thus everything defaults to arm. Another common thing that happens is the idea of really trying to get the hit too soon rather than setting yourself up. So this is one that I used to suffer from. We're in some sort of bind or what have you, and I see opening on his upper left. In particular for a right-hander, this is going to be a very common thing that you will deal with, and where you'll probably land the majority of your shots starting off with, right? Go and give me a little pressure up here. Perfect. 1, what do I want to hit? Am I choosing to hit his head? Am I choosing to hit his arm? What part of the arm? Upper arm, lower arm? Or am I choosing just to take this opening in general, right? Am I going for middle? That's a big difference. Because if I'm just swinging, okay, I hit his ribs, great, that's going to suck for him, and it didn't do me any good. Versus I'm choosing to hit his head. Now, important thing. When you ask yourself that question, what am I choosing to hit? I'm not going to add anything extra to myself. Now, I know obviously I'm talking through this, so this will look a little bit like, oh, believe me, I'm doing magic, right? But just watch my mechanics for a minute. I'm going to swing twice, where I don't care, and I'm just going to hit target. I'm not going to do it super hard, so don't brain Jake. And then the next 2 times, I'm going to call out what I want to hit. And I just want you to watch what happens with my body. So first, there's just 2 swings, one with a step, one without a step. Okay, and then with a step. Okay, I pulled a little bit to make sure, but we got kind of nape of neck, and then the first one was arm. Now, head. Shoulder. Arm. Now the important thing, you can relax, the important thing that I hope you will notice is that when I gave myself a target, my body started doing more. When I just cut, and that was the other thing, it was inconsistent, right? When I just cut, my arms are the only thing doing anything. Even if I stepped, this was not connected because my arms were outrunning the rest of me. When you give yourself a target, all that training that we were just doing kicks in. It's the idea of if I want to hit the head, I have to get this close to do so. And if I'm going to extend my arms, I need to make sure that I'm connecting this with my step. This will lead into not only making your strikes more effective, but bringing them back to that idea of extension. Same thing, especially in the arms regard, right? It wasn't me just whipping. It was the idea of I want to hit the arms, And since I'm hitting narrow target, my training kicks on, and yeah, I'm hitting Jake, but I'm hitting Jake as I'm leaving, which is a lot less worse than dense hit. So that's a big thing that can help, is choosing, hey, what am I gonna hit when I go this target, especially on the left side? You do the same on the right side all the time, right? Think about it. How many times do you just step up and go, I'm gonna cut him in the right elbow? Very rarely, right? But you usually do go head or arms all the time. Now, let's talk about a little bit more mechanics, right? Again, this is one that I suffer from. If we start adding in external mechanics, the idea of, okay, I'm gonna strike him in the head, but I'm gonna strike him in the head with the thumb grip, with the zwerk, okay? Now we need to talk about this, the big thing about thumb grips, and in general, anytime we start disconnecting ourselves, because this is the other time people get hit too hard, is when you start employing different kinds of grips, right, or momentum. Now, especially in regards to things like thumb grips, the important thing to be aware of is that a thumb grip can cut on its own independently of you. What I mean by that, Jake, just go and hold those arms, right? A normal cut for me to achieve it with any modicum of, engagement, I must bring my body into it. With a thumb grip, just by nature of turning over my arms, because it is a lever, that cuts with almost equal force to what I achieve with my body. Now, you can literally just swing harder and your body is not involved, but we very quickly realize that that is inefficient. Meaning that when you combine the independence of your arms with the blood being up, all of a sudden you're getting a lot more juice and it will lead to more hits. So, a place where this particularly impacts things is that people want to add a ton of speed into their hit, and they don't consider this disconnectivity. So let's look at the left smirk. Okay? Again, this is one that I really suffered from. So, I get someone really tied up over here, I see that head opening, I don't want to step forward, or if I do want to step forward, it's more outward. This is a great time for me to do this work. This is exactly what the book says to do, right? The issue that I need to remember when I do this is that I am not trying to hit him as quickly as possible. Because if I do that, my hands will turn over, and this will get so much velocity that when I strike, one, your targeting is probably not going to be very good, and two, that's going to be a lot of force. Because all that's moving here is I'm just preparing and pushing. By default, that always gets sword win. It's a fast mechanic. If I then add my step into that, I'm going to hit with a lot of juice very quickly, and depending upon where you target, this whole area can be quite detrimental. I have dented fencing masks. It's not that hard to do, and people out there have done worse, right? So, okay, does that mean I should not use these? No, of course not. You should absolutely use these. The question is, how do I use them effectively? My recommendation would be this. Let your thumb grip lead the way still. Use your body movement to temper it. So if I just use my arms here to strike Jake in the head, okay, I can hit him, right? Now I have to hit him with a little bit of extension, but not the worst thing in the world. I can hit Jake with sufficient force without needing to employ any part of my core. So I can now direct my core entirely on the idea of getting out of the way, which allows me now to temper how much that hit is coming in. So essentially, as my cut is coming around, my body comes behind it, but rather than applying extra into it, i.e. stumbling forward, I'm stepping out to make sure that I'm hitting with that extension once more, thus everything kind of terminates out. Now, this hit, I'm just going to tell you, is always going to have a bit of juice behind it. That's just the way it is. There are some cuts, especially from your left side, that will always just be a little bit harder. But by mitigating it with how much do I need, things will be a lot better. Another example, this is one I do all the time. The Flugelhop, right? I extend my point, Jake defends his head, now I go to take that arm. I could, absolutely, just jack up his arm with this push, but do I need to? Can I achieve what I want to achieve from there? You'll notice also, again, I chose to hit a particular target, not just wing this and probably end up hitting him beyond the protective gear. It is that active choice of what kind of step do I need? Cool. Does this make sense? As if the camera's going to answer me. But anyway, point being, whenever you start disconnecting your cut from yourself, and there are other examples. Thumb grip is the one I am most familiar with. Jake, I'm sure, can think of ones from Bolognese, or you could probably think of ones from your system, whatever you do. But the odds are those ones that kind of cut by themselves, you don't need your body to be adding things to it anymore. You can use your body to instead focus on either positioning, which makes your strike more idealized and thus softer. Or you can use it to focus on tempering, which is probably leading into your ability to then leave the situation. Now, the final thing I want to talk about in regards to situations where hard hits happen is, in particular, hits that are very quick, and usually they come at the cost of your body's connectivity. So a good example of this would be striking in the middle of the belly. So you see this a decent amount amongst people that are pretty good at this. I drive him up with a point, and then I choose to strike into that midsection. Now, I like doing this, no lie. I also like taking the arms with it. But the issue becomes when I take away all of what I just did and add in just hit. So, what I prefer to do to achieve this, I drive, and then I let myself extend, and I'm using my footwork to position myself away from whatever hit's going to come next, right? Meaning that for a moment, my arms are cutting at their maximum extension, which does not hit very hard. When I instead focus more on just hitting, that's going to be a lot denser and a lot less pleasant. And I still pulled that shot. So, sometimes this is unavoidable. If Jake is coming forward as he defends, he will get closer to me. But the question then becomes, okay, how much can I do? Is it his fault? Is it my fault, etc.? And owning up to it yourself. My goal, when I do something along these lines, a disconnected cut where I am free cutting, I'm just taking a target, is I'm not putting my hips into this. I don't need to, right? Same thing when I'm throwing, one-handed cut to the leg or things along those lines, or a very quick shot to the top of the head, what have you. Do I need my hips here? Answer, no, focus on position. If Jake happens to be stepping forward as he guards, that is not my fault. But I'm not contributing to making it worse. So what I want you to consider when it comes to striking against people, number one, aim for the protective gear that we're wearing. It's over important parts of our body. We guard the parts that matter because that's also where we're striking, right? Number two, don't just hit. Even when I am targeting like Jake's head, it's where that band is. It's the safest parts of the head, right? When I go to strike, I'm always targeting something actively, and that helps line my body up because odds are you are training to do so. No one just says, yeah, swing at this opening and you'll be fine. There's correctiveness there, right? Always try to go for the best option. Always make sure that you are only putting in as necessary. And not only will you most likely not hit people as hard, you'll hit them more effectively, and you'll have more options. When I do a cut with structure, I often say I can't make something out of nothing, right? When I just finish with a cut, whatever cut it may be, right? Whatever, right? That's a cut. I'm in a position where I can move again because I chose to hit, and hey, now I'm in a place where it makes sense for me to keep moving. Versus if we just find, he parried it. I'm out of ideas, right? I have lost my presence. You will find that it's easier for you to then keep going because you're going down a familiar train. That's why we train these things. And then finally, in regards to, his part of it, if he chooses to do certain things, I'm trying to strike him in the head and he put his hand in the way, that's not on you, right? Obviously, you can try and mitigate it, and with sufficient training, you can pull shots if things look bad, right? If I find myself in a position where I'm going to hit Jake in the back of the head, one, I could choose not to. Just presenting is usually fine without even making contact. Or alternatively, one of the things that I'll do, if I get side position, I strike to the top of the head rather than any sort of angle just in case. I talked about this in detail when I went over mollering, driving to the top of the head rather than the sides of the head. But all these choices are things that you can make, and cutting with good extension should mitigate the amount of oof that you experience when you are free playing, because that's the main idea, right? Even in earnestness. I'm taking his life somewhat into my hands, and I hope that he does the same. Treat others as you want to be treated, because, there's still 1:29 left on the clock, so be nice. The only other thing I want to talk about before I finish this off is the idea of thrusts. Now, for the most part, thrusts really aren't that bad, especially with the fetters that people are using of any sort of sort. They're pretty nice, but just a couple little things you can do to ensure that the flexes are going to be nice. Number one, don't thrust dead on, right? And if you do, you should only be at your maximum extension. A perfect example of this would be Fiore's thrust over the arm, so let's switch sides. The idea of, he has cut in against me, I have wedged, I take target thrust. That's fine, because again, I'm not driving into him with my full body. I'm already at extension, and I'm basically just sort of poking him. That's a situation where this being straight up, straight down does not matter, right? When it's just that, you're okay. When it comes to anything where my body is going behind it, then I need to start considering, not only for my own safety, but I need to start considering where my blade is going. So, for example, we'll have you go to the shoulder. One of the more common ones that you will see is the idea of striking and then winding up. Now, this is some benefits, not only in regards to defense, but also in regards to the way our swords are built. It will start bowing inward. Even if I'm doing something like a thumb grip, it starts bowing outward. This ensures that I will not cause him great deals of harm when it goes in, because the sword is designed to flex. Now, one of the things that people try to do to make this nicer is they let their arms relax, right? So that would be the idea of I get my point on target, and then I let my arms relax. I don't recommend you ever do this. 2 reasons. Number 1, it's not doing me any favors. If he decides to bring his arms down right now, even through my blade, I am boned, right? Number 2 is because that sword still has momentum. That momentum is still being carried by me. Rather than me trusting in the flex of the sword and the flex of his gear to do its job, which also tells him, hey, you can stop fighting, I'm putting things entirely into the hands of however it may end up. I see that happen a lot. I see people try to mitigate hits by, oh, I'll be helpful to them, I'll pull the shot. Don't. Target where you're supposed to target. Let him learn how to receive hits on those targets, and he won't have the tendency to then flinch, right? Which is the opposite side of things. If you're going to get hit in the head, get hit in the head, right? Jake is learning that's not the worst thing in the world. So he can start identifying, hey, when something's coming toward that opening, he knows what is just enough and no more. But if his reflex is always to do this, he will always do that. And now I went from doing a good cut to hitting him in the back of the head and being thrown out of the tournament. So that really kind of wraps this all up. But the main idea here is, again, use the protective gear, actively target, actively extend, spend a little bit of time before you launch your hit, and practice it regularly. How much is enough? How much is me just swinging to hit him? And one of the things I would highly recommend you do is next time you fence, only throw shots at his person that you actively chose. If you feel yourself starting to go and you're just, oh, I'm going for this, stop. Get out of there, reassess, keep going in. It goes a long way to not only giving you more control of the fight, but ensuring that you will have more fights. So, thank you very much, Jay. And thank you all very much for watching. We will go over some other techniques another time.